Quite a surprise to see Israel target him on Iranian soil. The question now, and I'd like to turn to you, Dan, is what you think we're going to see in terms of a response from Iran. We know that Iran is saying that they're vowing a major attack, but obviously when they fired over 300 missiles at Israel on April 13th, wasn't particularly effective.
Yeah, I mean, Iran has levers they can deploy. Iran has militias arrayed against Israel, not only in Yemen and in Lebanon, but also in Syria and in Iraq. And they can certainly cause mayhem. And by the way, the sleeper cells in Jordan is perhaps the most dangerous thing. Iran could start to seriously try to destabilize Jordan. They have mayhem that they can pursue for sure. Now, historically, Iran has liked to present itself as not driven by quotidian events, but rather by a long-term strategy, and they're not going to react to anything like a bunch of children, but rather like adults in the Persian market are going to wait to exact their price when it suits them. That was believed for a time to be Iran's modus operandi. However, what happened last April put paid to it because they reacted very quickly to the assassination that they were reacting to, which occurred in Syria. So it remains to be seen, but realistically, Iran at this point seems so invested, at least as long as the Gaza war goes on, in causing difficulty for Israel, that I don't think they needed this necessarily to move them into a different phase. Mm-hmm. And at least if you listen to Israeli intelligence, and there's a reason to believe it might be true, Iran and Hezbollah right now have an interest in pushing the envelope as far as it can be pushed without falling off the table. In other words, they don't want a true regional war. They just want to make things as difficult as possible in aid of the Palestinians. Outrageous though Israelis in the West may see that. We see it as a provocation, of course. They see it as part of the Palestinian war.
We are now seeing rare displays of open support for Hamas in the West Bank following the killing of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh. Palestinian factions in the West Bank have called for a general strike and marches to protest his assassination. And Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas has also announced a national day of mourning, and Palestinian flags will be flown at half-staff throughout the rest of the day. I'd like to turn back to our guests in studio. All right, Dan, what does this tell us about, Palestinian support for both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority at this point?
Well, Hamas is very popular, especially in West Bank, because the West Bank hasn't been under the boot of Hamas, so they perhaps can sort of afford to ignore what it would be like if Hamas did come to power in the West Bank. As for Abbas, he's a weak leader in his pretending to be upset over the demise of Haniyeh. He's trying to hold on to some support, and obviously it's a populist move. It shows us basically that hypocrisy in politics is not unique to Israel, the U.S., or the West. It very much is alive and kicking in the West Bank, Palestinian world, and in general, the region.
And I think that the normalization of what is happening in the West Bank and Hezbollah is the same issue. It's okay that they are attacking us. It's okay that they are doing some terror attacks. It's okay, this is not escalation. This is okay, this is acceptable. They're firing 200, 300 rockets per day. This is okay, this is not escalation. This is normal. This is what is being said here.
No, I never said it's not an escalation.
It's escalation because they're going...
I said the Majd al-Shams thing was a mistake that was eventually going to happen given the steady state that we've had since October, which is an outrage. And a normal government would have moved against it long ago after.
Perfect, but okay, so let's go to the West Bank, and you see what is happening over there. There are soldiers of the Palestinian Authority that are, or policemen, never mind how we want to call them, and they are committing terror attacks. They are training in the same scenarios as it was in Gaza, and everybody is keep on in silence. And of course, this is flaming Hamas stories and heroism stories from the Gaza Strip.
Hold on, may I respond?
Of course.
In the Gaza Strip, you had Hamas holding camps for kids where they were trained to attack Israeli sites and kill Jews. And they were told that this is the purpose of their existence. And this is not happening with the Palestinian soldiers / policemen in the West Bank, who are credited by the Shin Bet and the IDF with pretty consistent security collaboration with Israel, coordination with Israel, throughout this entire nightmare. The conflation of the PA and of Hamas is some kind of weird right-wing talking point that will really kind of lead to Armageddon. I'm not saying that a PA is perfect, far from it. I'm saying there is, imperfect and maybe sometimes pretty bad versus satanic and demonic. And an adult knows how to identify the less bad option.
The latest, polls coming out of the Palestinian territories, essentially pointing to the fact that there's pretty much dismal support for the Palestinian Authority as a whole. So no matter what rhetoric is coming out of the mouth of the Palestinian Authority, we're seeing growing support for Hamas.
Oh, that's for sure. I have to assess that the reason why Hamas is more popular in the PA and West Bank right now is precisely because the PA doesn't do these things that you're ascribing to it. They're trying somehow to keep a lid on the insanity and coordinate with Israel somewhat. I understand that textbooks are not that great and many other things to complain about. But, I mean, the PA is not holding training camps for kids to massacre Jews, clearly. And perhaps the Palestinian people, lamentably, many of them actually want that and reward it politically.
It is noteworthy that this attack was carried out on Iranian territory, where he was on an official invitation to the inauguration ceremony of Iranian President-elect Masoud Pezeshkian. It is clear that the organizers of this political assassination were aware of the dangerous consequences of this action for the entire region.
Well, you know, if anybody was blind to the connection between the so-called axis of resistance and the fact that Iran kind of has its tentacles in multiple different nation states, I mean, just the kind of chorus of condemnation that we're seeing right now coming out on many fronts points to what appears to be a united front in terms of the type of response that Israel is going to see.
Well, in that part of the world, the axis of resistance, or maybe some would call it the axis of evil. I would call it the axis of hypocrisy. I mean, what next? We're going to hear Putin advise against using assassination as a tool of diplomacy. It's completely absurd. But China obviously has decided to take the side of Hamas and the Palestinians in this conflict, maybe because of their own concerns about the Uyghurs and Muslims in China. I don't know what on earth it could be, but this is a choice they've clearly made, at least in public.
Or burgeoning, you know, relations with Iran.
The evil axis is for many years, it consists of Iran, Russia, China, Pakistan, North Korea. These are the folks. These are the bad axis. They are cooperating together for many years. It's not a new one.
At the end of the day, as far as Hezbollah, and I think also Iran is concerned, once the war in Gaza stops, they'll cease the fire. The question is, will the residents of the north be willing to return with just Hezbollah deciding not to shoot, but not leaving the area along the border?
You mentioned IDF Chief of Staff Halevi, who actually came out today and said, we will not accept Hezbollah's presence on the border. Returning to October 6th is not the goal. So what is the goal at this point? Is it even attainable without a larger scale war?
I think one of the major problems is that the world hasn't really come to grips with what's happened to Lebanon. The situation with Israel and Palestinians, Hamas, is complicated. The history is so convoluted. No one knows what to make, how to make head or tails of it. But in Lebanon, it's really quite simple. A criminal militia has occupied a third of the country and is using that occupation to create mayhem, and it's stronger than the government. So Lebanon is a failed state. Unlike with Hamas and Israel, there's no complex narrative. There's no question of what happened in '48. Hezbollah is in the wrong. And Lebanon is as much a victim of this as Israel is. And it's about time they admitted that they can't do anything about it. And if Lebanon had a shred of a shadow of a spine, they would ask for help. And frankly, the West and NATO should give them that help. There are two ways this can end, I think, reasonably. One is Hezbollah agrees to implement 1701, pulls back from the border, and begins talks in exchange for maybe recognition as a political force on disarmament. And the other is that some force or other moves into South Lebanon and gives them what for. And that can be Israel, or it can be a global force or a regional force. And I personally hope that it won't be Israel. I think the world has to step in and understand that to allow this complete breakdown of the global order to continue should not be, to prevent this from happening, should not be Israel's problem alone, just because Israel's on the front line and has to deal with the rockets coming in. It is a global problem. And if Israel does move in, and I have to add, Israel currently has a not particularly responsible government. If Israel in its current form moves into Lebanon and fights Hezbollah on the ground, that is a highway to regional conflagration of every conceivable level, and the West will be pulled in anyway. So there is a point where when dealing with the bully, you make threats. I think a major threat needs to be made right now to Hezbollah, with Lebanon being told to put up or shut up, basically, because this cannot possibly go on. So yes, I do agree. Even if they cease fire, after the war in Lebanon and Gaza ends, Israel cannot and should not, and the world should not allow Hezbollah to continue to occupy Lebanon.
I want to just add, I agree with everything that was said. And this spreads beyond just Lebanon. Last week, following the deadly drone strike from Yemen, launched by the Houthis, the former Houthi spokesperson told us in an interview, plain and simple, the Houthis, like Hezbollah, like Iran, they're not just Israel's problem, they're the world's problem. And specifically regarding the Houthis, the world, there was a Western coalition alongside an Arab coalition until 2018. But in 2018, Western powers abandoned that coalition, left the Arab coalition on its own. And we're seeing what that did to the Houthis and their willingness to carry out attacks that disrupt the entire global maritime trade.
I think that we need to look much more behind the narrow look at this is Hezbollah and Lebanon. This is Iranian issue. And the Iranian wants to control, to be the superpower of the Middle East. That's the issue. And using the proxies as Hezbollah and the Houthis, which are much more of the same, they want to control.
So Dan, the big question is what comes next now. First of all, is Israel perhaps done with sending its message to both Hezbollah and Iran and Hamas? Or are we going to see continued attacks?
I think Israel probably will continue to try to assassinate Yahya Sinwar. And, in the end, if you kill everyone, then, yeah, you've destroyed Hezbollah. Look, assassinations in history are generally seen as a terrible thing. A huge exception has been made for these terrorist groups and their leaders, and we're clearly in a profound moment vis-a-vis that, where 3 of them have occurred in the past several weeks. Why does Israel do this? Why does the U.S. do this? For retribution, for deterrence, and for diplomacy by other means. Retribution is accomplished. A lot of people are very happy today. Deterrence, we know, doesn't really work. We're talking about fanatics. Diplomacy by another means, that's where the big question mark is right now, and we'll have to see. I'm not a skeptic about these talks, nor about the U.S. desire to push them along. I would welcome, as I said, global diplomacy at this moment of perhaps confusion and weakness in the terrorist groups to maybe push us into a better reality, but I think it will require a lot of determination, some real muscle as well, the threat of it, and also possibly money.
But we also know that President Biden is headed out of office very shortly, just a couple of months. We could be looking at a completely different government in the United States if Kamala Harris does not win. I mean, how is this ultimately going to impact the ongoing war?
Look, Biden's still around for 6 more months, and it would be a sad statement if the war was still around in 6 months. I would say at that point, if it is, then we will have seen a massive escalation. So let's not write Biden off quite yet. That said, Kamala Harris is a bit of a cipher. A lot of nonsense is being said about Kamala Harris because she, in fact, is not that well known and hasn't been that impactful as a vice president. Indeed, few vice presidents are. I think she's going to try to prove herself with statements mainly in the next couple of months. And I wouldn't rule out that she surprises a lot of people because if the Democrats do their calculation correctly, other than in the state of Michigan, they need to appeal to the center. And Biden was a guy who declares himself a Zionist and is a proven lifelong lover of Israel. Harris is not necessarily that way. I think she's being falsely portrayed as some kind of a woke extremist. She's married to a Jew. Her policies have been centrist. In some ways, they've been a little bit tough when she was a prosecutor in California. She may surprise. I think she'll seek to surprise. So to answer your question, there may be no difference at all.
All right, well, as per usual, we're going to have to wait and find out. I'd like to thank all of our guests for joining us today in studio. Unfortunately, that is it. We are wrapping up our show for now.